I've always been a man who craved stability, but life had other plans for me. Growing up as the son of a diplomat meant I never stayed in one place for long. By the time I turned 18, I had lived in 12 countries and could hold a polite conversation in 5 languages. Sounds glamorous, doesn't it? But for me, it was exhausting. Constant change shaped me into someone who could adapt to anything, yet deep down, I longed for something unshakable, something that would last. That desire for stability drove every major decision in my life. After college, I enlisted in the Air Force, hoping the rigid structure would bring me the order I'd been missing. My time in the military wasn't easy, but it was purposeful. I specialized in cybersecurity, working in intelligence units focused on Eastern Europe. My job wasn't the kind of thing you brag about over beers. Most of the time, it involved staring at screens, combing through data, and unraveling cryptic financial networks. Every now and then, though, we'd strike gold, dismantling covert operations or cutting off enemy funding streams. I was good at it, damn good. So good, in fact, that I managed to stash away a tidy sum from, let's call them gray area opportunities. No, I wasn't a thief. But let's just say I ensured a few shady organizations couldn't get their money back once we froze their accounts. That money, hidden away in a Luxembourg bank, would become my safety net later in life. When I left the military at 40, I had one goal: build something I could finally call my own. With my expertise in cybersecurity, I started a boutique firm specializing in protecting high-profile clients and corporations from data breaches. It was hard work, but I thrived. My company became known for its discretion and effectiveness, and over the years, I built a life that was steady, predictable, and mine. But there was one thing missing. For all my professional success, my personal life had been sparse. I'd never married. Oh, I'd come close once or twice, but those relationships were casualties of my constant moving and military service. By the time I hit 45, I'd resigned myself to the idea that maybe I wasn't meant for that kind of companionship. And then Julia walked into my life. It was a routine bank appointment, nothing special. I needed to finalize a loan to expand my company's office space, and she was the financial advisor assigned to my case. Julia was stunning, the kind of woman who could make a room feel brighter just by stepping into it. But it wasn't just her looks that caught my attention. She had a sharp wit and a warmth that disarmed me immediately. Cybersecurity? Huh? She'd said, raising an eyebrow as she scanned my loan documents. That sounds like something out of a spy novel. Only if spy novels involve a lot of sitting and staring at monitors, I'd replied with a grin. She laughed, a genuine, melodic laugh that made me feel like the world wasn't such a serious place after all. By the end of the meeting, I'd worked up the nerve to ask her to coffee. She said yes, and what started as a casual meeting quickly snowballed into something more. Julia was 45, just a few years younger than me, and just as ambitious. She'd built a solid career in financial advising, but her real dream was to break into luxury real estate. She talked about it with a fire in her eyes that I couldn't help but admire. I want to develop properties that people don't just live in, they experience, she told me over dinner one night. I'll admit, I was captivated. Julia had a way of making you believe anything was possible. And for the first time in years, I started to think that maybe, just maybe, I'd found the stability I'd been chasing all my life. Our relationship grew quickly. She moved into my house after 6 months, and we began blending our lives. I helped her lay the groundwork for her real estate ambitions, and she encouraged me to take risks with my business. It felt like we were building something together, and for a while, I was genuinely happy. But life has a funny way of reminding you that stability is never guaranteed. Looking back, I can't pinpoint the exact moment things started to change. Maybe it was when Julia started staying late at work more often, or when she began taking calls in the other room. At first, I didn't think much of it. We were both busy professionals with demanding schedules. But then the excuses started piling up. Dinner ran late with a client. Sorry, I lost track of time at the office. It's just a work thing. You wouldn't understand. Little things, each one insignificant on its own. But together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I've spent my life analyzing patterns, finding hidden connections in data. And as much as I wanted to believe Julia was different, that our relationship was unshakable, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. That's the thing about stability. Once you find it, you'll do anything to protect it, even if it means uncovering truths you'd rather not face. If you'd seen us together, you'd think Julia and I were the perfect couple. We attended charity events arm in arm, our laughter echoing through the halls as if we didn't have a care in the world. Friends commented on how lucky I was, how radiant she looked by my side. And she did look radiant. Julia had a magnetic energy that made people gravitate toward her. It wasn't just her beauty, though she had plenty of that. It was the way she carried herself, confident and self-assured. From the outside, our relationship seemed flawless. Even I believed it for a time. Our mornings were a quiet ritual. Julia loved the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and I'd always make sure the pot was ready before she came downstairs. She'd sit at the kitchen island in her silk robe, flipping through real estate listings on her tablet, her hair still damp from the shower. I'd ask about her plans for the day, and she'd light up as she talked about potential properties and client meetings. "You know, Mark," she said one morning, swirling her coffee, "if I could get that development deal with the city, it would be a game changer. 10 luxury units, all waterfront. It's a dream project. I have no doubt you'll get it," I replied, meaning every word. "You're unstoppable when you set your mind to something," and I believed that. Julia was driven in a way I admired. It made me want to support her, to help her reach her goals. I saw her ambition as an extension of the fire that had drawn me to her in the first place. When she mentioned that she'd need extra capital to back the project, I didn't hesitate. I'd worked hard to build my cybersecurity firm and had saved more than I'd ever need for myself. Helping Julia felt like an investment not just in her, but in our future together. I gave her access to a joint account, one she could dip into for her business needs. At the time, I didn't think twice about it. As the months passed, Julia's work seemed to consume her. She started taking on more late-night meetings and weekend calls. "Networking is everything in real estate," she'd say with a bright smile, as if the hours spent away were a small price to pay for her success. I tried not to let it bother me. I'd always prided myself on being understanding, on giving her the space to chase her dreams. But the late nights stretched longer, and the excuses began to feel thinner. "Dinner ran late," she'd say, texting me at midnight. "Sorry, a client needed advice on a zoning issue." There was always a reason, and I wanted to believe her. But then there were the phone calls. She started taking them in the other room. Her voice hushed as she spoke. When I asked, she brushed it off as business-related. "Confidential client stuff," she said with a wave of her hand. "You wouldn't be interested." I told myself it was nothing. After all, I'd spent years in a career that demanded discretion. Who was I to question hers? Still, the nagging doubt lingered. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what felt off, but something had shifted. It was little things at first. The way she'd glance at her phone and quickly lock the screen when I walked into the room. The faint smell of a cologne that wasn't mine clinging to her jacket after she came home late. "You're overthinking it," I told myself. "She's busy. You're busy. This is what life is like when you're both chasing big goals." But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The cracks in the illusion began to widen one Saturday when Julia told me she had an all-day business seminar. She left early, dressed impeccably in a tailored blazer and pencil skirt, her confidence radiating as she kissed me on the cheek and walked out the door. That afternoon, while tidying the house, I noticed her tablet sitting on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought, but as I reached to move it, the screen lit up with a notification. A message preview from someone named Daniel Green. "Looking forward to seeing you tonight," it read, followed by a winking emoji. My hand froze. I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Who was Daniel Green? And what did he mean by tonight? I set the tablet down carefully, as if it might shatter under my grip. My stomach churned with unease, but I forced myself to act as though nothing had changed. Julia returned that evening, smiling as she breezed through the door, carrying takeout for dinner. "How was the seminar?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "Great," she said, placing the bags on the counter. "Learned a lot about market trends. It'll really help with the project I'm pitching." I nodded, watching her closely. There was no guilt in her expression, no hesitation in her movements. She was so composed, so natural, that I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and I knew it wouldn't take long to grow. The seemingly perfect relationship was beginning to unravel, and I was determined to find out why. I've always trusted my instincts. It's what kept me alive during my years in the Air Force and what built my cybersecurity business from the ground up. But now, that same gut feeling was telling me something I didn't want to believe. Julia was hiding something from me. The message from Daniel Green replayed in my head like a broken record. "Looking forward to seeing you tonight." The words weren't inherently damning, but the wink emoji, that was a different story. For days, I kept telling myself to let it go, to give her the benefit of the doubt. After all, we built a life together. Surely, she wouldn't risk everything we had for some fleeting affair. But the signs, subtle and persistent, wouldn't stop piling up. One night, as Julia sat across from me at dinner, her phone buzzed against the table. She picked it up with practiced ease, angling the screen away from me. Her fingers moved quickly, tapping out a response, before she set the phone back down. "Who's that?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Just a client," she said without missing a beat. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The small details didn't escape me. The way she seemed glued to her phone whenever we were home, the late nights she claimed were spent with investors, the slightly evasive tone when I asked about her day. For years, I'd worked in a world of covert operations, where people rarely said what they meant and secrets were currency. It was the kind of environment where you learn to read between the lines, to pick up on inconsistencies, and to recognize when someone is lying. And Julia? She was lying. I decided to start small, to see just how far this went. Julia had mentioned that she was meeting a potential investor for dinner on Wednesday. When I asked which restaurant, she named an upscale Italian place downtown. That evening, after she left, I grabbed my keys and drove to the restaurant. I parked across the street and waited, keeping my car angled for a clear view of the entrance. Julia didn't know I'd followed her, and I intended to keep it that way. About 30 minutes later, I saw her arrive. She stepped out of an Uber, wearing a fitted black dress and a confident smile. She looked stunning, but my focus wasn't on her. It was on who she was meeting. A tall man in a gray suit approached her at the entrance. They greeted each other warmly, too warmly for a business meeting. He placed a hand on her lower back as they walked inside. I didn't need an introduction to know this was Daniel Green. I stayed in the car, fighting the urge to storm inside. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Rationally, I knew confronting her now wouldn't accomplish anything. If this was what I thought it was, I needed proof. The next day, I decided it was time to lean into my skills. Julia had underestimated me, likely thinking I wouldn't notice or wouldn't care enough to investigate. She was wrong. I installed a discreet tracking device on her car while she was in the shower. It was small, nearly undetectable, and would allow me to monitor her movements through an app on my phone. I also placed a recording device in her handbag, one that would activate whenever it detected voices. Was it an invasion of privacy? Absolutely. But I wasn't interested in moral debates. I needed the truth, and I'd do whatever it took to get it. Over the next week, Julia's patterns became clear. Her so-called client dinners often ended at a boutique hotel on the edge of town, where she spent hours before returning home. The recordings painted an even darker picture. Conversations with Daniel were peppered with flirtation and innuendo, confirming what I'd feared. Their relationship wasn't professional, but it wasn't just the affair that caught my attention. It was their talk of money. My money. One evening, as I reviewed the latest recording, I heard Daniel's voice clearly for the first time. "So, when will the funds be available?" he asked. "Soon," Julia replied. "Mark won't suspect anything. He trusts me." The casual tone in her voice sent a chill down my spine. She sounded so confident, so assured that I wouldn't notice her siphoning money from our joint account. My trust in her wasn't just a weakness she was exploiting. It was a tool she was using against me. By the end of the week, I'd pieced together their plan. Julia was funneling money from our account into a shell corporation that Daniel controlled. The funds were being used to back a real estate project in the city, a high-risk venture that could pay off big, but only if it succeeded. If it failed, though, they wouldn't be the ones left holding the bag. I would. At this point, I had enough evidence to confront Julia. But something stopped me. A direct confrontation would only give her a chance to spin the story, to weasel her way out of it with excuses or half-truths. No, I needed to wait. To let her dig her hole a little deeper. The seemingly perfect relationship was nothing but a facade, and I was about to dismantle it brick by brick. For now, I'd let Julia think she was winning, but the game had only just begun. The hardest part of any betrayal is the silence. Pretending that everything is fine while the person you love chips away at the life you built together. That's where I found myself, eating breakfast with Julia, exchanging pleasantries, all while knowing she was stealing from me, lying to me, and sleeping with someone else. But I stayed calm. If there's one thing my years in the Air Force taught me, it's patience. The ability to wait, to let the pieces fall into place before making a move. Confronting Julia now would only warn her, give her a chance to cover her tracks. No, I needed her to believe she was still in control. In the days that followed, I began methodically executing my plan. Step 1 was protecting my assets. Julia thought she had access to my money, but she underestimated just how much I kept under the radar. Most of my wealth wasn't in our joint account. It was tied up in offshore holdings, investments, and the Luxembourg fund I'd created years ago. I contacted my financial advisor, an old friend from my military days, and arranged to transfer the remainder of the joint account into a series of private trusts under aliases. It wasn't an overnight process, but by the end of the week, the account Julia was siphoning from was empty. Her reaction was subtle at first. A few annoyed comments about bank errors and delayed transactions. I played dumb, pretending to be just as confused as she was. Inside, I smiled. Next, I focused on gathering evidence. The tracker on her car, the recording device in her purse, and the surveillance software I'd installed on her laptop gave me everything I needed. I now had proof of her affair with Daniel and records of her financial manipulations. The conversations they had were damning. "Mark's too distracted with his business to notice," Julia said in one recording. "Once the funds are through, we'll close the deal. He'll never see it coming." "Good," Daniel replied. "I don't want him sniffing around. We're already cutting it close with the permits." Hearing them talk about me like that, like I was some naive fool, stung. But it also steeled my resolve. They were treating me like a pawn, but they had no idea who they were playing with. With my assets secure and my evidence airtight, it was time to lay the groundwork for their downfall. The first step was to sabotage the real estate project they were pouring my money into. I used a fake email account to contact the city inspector overseeing Daniel's permits. Disguised as an anonymous whistleblower, I flagged inconsistencies in the project's funding and alerted them to zoning violations that I knew would slow everything down. Next, I reached out to a competitor of Daniel's, a ruthless developer known for exploiting opportunities. I fed him just enough information about Daniel's plans to pique his interest, knowing he'd swoop in and undercut them at the first chance. But my real masterpiece was the shell corporation they'd created to funnel the funds. I hacked into their financial records and planted just enough fraudulent activity to raise red flags. A few well-placed tips to the IRS ensured that their accounts would come under scrutiny. It wasn't just about stopping their project, it was about making sure they had no way out. Through it all, I had to keep up appearances at home. Julia's mask of normalcy never wavered, and neither did mine. "Work's been crazy," she said one evening, pouring herself a glass of wine. "But I think the deal is finally coming together." "That's great," I replied, feigning pride. "I always knew you'd make it happen." I watched her sip her wine, completely unaware that the deal she was so confident about was already falling apart. As much as I wanted to believe I had the upper hand, there were moments when doubt crept in. What if Julia discovered what I was doing? What if she realized the money was gone or caught on to the delays in their project? One evening, I found her sitting in the living room, scrolling through her laptop with a look of frustration. "Something wrong?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "It's nothing," she said quickly, closing the screen, but her eyes lingered on me for a moment too long. For the first time, I wondered if she suspected me. Despite my doubts, I pressed forward. Julia and Daniel were so consumed by their own plans that they didn't notice the traps closing in around them. By the end of the week, I'd secured a new place, a sleek penthouse in another city, far away from the mess I was about to leave behind. The lease was in a false name, and the utilities were paid through dummy accounts. It was my escape route, ready for the moment I pulled the trigger. But first, I needed one last piece of evidence. The following Saturday, Julia told me she'd be working late again. This time, I decided to follow her. I parked a block away from her destination, a boutique hotel I'd seen pop up on the tracker before. From the shadows, I watched as Daniel arrived, greeting her with a kiss in the hotel lobby. They disappeared into the elevator, laughing like teenagers. That was all I needed. I sat in my car, the weight of everything settling on my shoulders. The evidence was undeniable. The plan was in motion, and soon, Julia and Daniel's world would come crashing down. I smiled to myself, knowing that the setup was complete. All that was left now was to watch it all fall apart. I had everything I needed. The evidence, the plan, the means to walk away and leave Julia and Daniel in the ruins of their own betrayal. It should have been the beginning of the end for them. But as I sat at my desk late one night, reviewing the final pieces of the puzzle, I stumbled across something that changed everything. It started with a routine scan of Julia's emails. By this point, I knew her habits well. When she used her personal email, when she switched to encrypted messaging apps. Most of what I found was predictable. Conversations with Daniel about their project, the occasional flirty exchange. But then there was an email, buried among the others, sent from a name I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Critical update on target." My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't their usual affair chatter or financial scheming. This was something else entirely. I opened the email and began reading. The message wasn't long, but it was damning. "Daniel, the initial breach was successful, but we need more access points. Julia's role is critical. Keep her in play. Mark systems are more sophisticated than anticipated, but with a little more time, we'll have everything we need." Okay. My stomach churned as I reread the email. It wasn't just about Julia stealing my money or having an affair. This was about my business. My cybersecurity firm was being targeted, and Julia was the inside link. The more I looked, the worse it got. Hidden in Julia's encrypted messages were conversations with Daniel and someone referred to only as K. They weren't just conspiring to siphon funds for their real estate venture. They were using Julia's access to me to dismantle my company from the inside. Daniel wasn't just some sleazy developer. He was working with K to obtain proprietary software from my firm. My systems, which protected governments and Fortune 500 companies from data breaches, were the real prize. They wanted to steal my algorithms, sell them to the highest bidder, and leave me with the fallout. The recordings I'd collected started making more sense now. There were phrases I hadn't paid much attention to before. Tightening the window, penetration points, risk mitigation. They weren't talking about real estate. They were talking about hacking my systems. And Julia? She wasn't just some pawn being used by Daniel. She was an active participant. She knew exactly what she was doing. "I've got Mark exactly where I need him," she'd said in one recording. "He's too focused on the company to notice what's happening around him. By the time he figures it out, it'll be too late." Too late. The words echoed in my mind, fueling a fire I didn't know I had. The game had changed. Julia and Daniel weren't just cheating me out of money. They were threatening to destroy everything I'd built. My company wasn't just a business. It was my legacy, my proof that I could create something lasting. I wasn't about to let them take that away from me. But this wasn't just about protecting my company anymore. It was about making them pay. I shifted my focus, digging deeper into Daniel's connections and tracing the mysterious K. What I found was a network of shell companies and offshore accounts, all tied to a shadowy organization that specialized in corporate espionage. Daniel was a small player in a much larger game. I couldn't take this to the authorities, not yet. I needed more. Something that would not only stop them but destroy them. I spent the next few days creating a honey trap within my company's network. I crafted a fake project, complete with false files and encrypted data that appeared to be high-value proprietary software. Then I created a backdoor that would allow me to trace any attempts to download or share the data. When Julia accessed my laptop one evening, as I pretended to be asleep on the couch, I knew the bait had been taken. By the time she transferred the files to Daniel, I had everything I needed: timestamps, IP addresses, even surveillance footage of her logging in. But I didn't stop there. Using my contacts in the cybersecurity world, I flagged the stolen files and sent anonymous alerts to law enforcement agencies known for cracking down on corporate espionage. It was only a matter of time before the walls started closing in on them. Julia was none the wiser. At breakfast, she kissed me on the cheek and talked about her big meeting with Daniel that afternoon. I nodded, playing the part of the supportive partner, all while knowing exactly where she was going and what she was about to do. My patience had paid off, but the stakes were higher now than I'd ever imagined. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about survival. As Julia walked out the door, I allowed myself one final moment of doubt. Could I really go through with this? Could I watch her and Daniel's lives implode under the weight of their own greed? The answer was clear. They left me no choice. Now, it was my turn to play the game, and I wasn't planning to lose. The morning of Julia's big meeting with Daniel, I woke up early and took my time getting ready. I had an almost eerie sense of calm about me. Everything was in place, every detail accounted for. By the end of the day, the empire Julia and Daniel thought they were building would come crashing down. I reviewed my honey trap one last time. The fake project files Julia had stolen were already flagged by multiple international cybersecurity agencies. A quiet tip to an old friend at Interpol ensured the authorities were watching the moment those files started circulating. I had rigged this so thoroughly that any move they made would tighten the noose around their necks. All I had to do was sit back and let the dominoes fall. Around noon, I checked the tracking app I'd set up to monitor Julia's car. She'd arrived at the usual boutique hotel. Daniel's car was already there, parked out front like a prize he was showing off. I let out a humorless chuckle. He probably thought today was a celebration, the culmination of their months of scheming. Little did he know, it was the beginning of the end. I logged into the surveillance system I'd installed on Julia's laptop weeks ago. Sure enough, her screen was active, and I could see her preparing the fake files for their presentation. It was all going according to plan. By 1:30 p.m., Daniel and Julia had transferred the flagged files to an encrypted server hosted under one of Daniel's many shell companies. The moment the transfer was complete, the server lit up like a Christmas tree on law enforcement radar. The first alert came from a cybersecurity watchdog in London, then another from Singapore. Within minutes, a coordinated response team was mobilized. By 2 p.m., Interpol had flagged the IP address, traced it to Daniel's corporation, and frozen his assets. Meanwhile, I sent an anonymous email to Daniel's investors, complete with detailed evidence of his illegal activities. The emails contained a mix of real and fabricated data, just enough to make him look like a liability they couldn't afford to touch. I imagined the chaos erupting in their office, Daniel scrambling to explain why his accounts were frozen, why his backers were suddenly pulling out. The beauty of it all was that Julia and Daniel had no idea I was behind it. To them, it would look like bad luck or a well-timed whistleblower. When Julia returned home that evening, she looked exhausted but tried to hide it. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, acting as though it was just another day. I could tell something had gone wrong. Her usual composure was cracking, her hands trembling slightly as she poured herself a glass of wine. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Yeah, you could say that," she replied, not meeting my eyes. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "Anything you want to talk about?" Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing slightly. For a brief moment, I thought she'd try to come clean. But then she plastered on that familiar, disarming smile. "No, just work stuff. You know how it is." I couldn't help but laugh. A genuine, full-bodied laugh that made her freeze mid-sip. "What's so funny?" she asked cautiously. "Oh, nothing," I said, standing and walking toward her. "Just that I already know, Julia. About all of it." The color drained from her face. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, setting her glass down. "The affair with Daniel. The money you were stealing. The files you helped him steal from my company." My voice was calm, steady, but each word hit her like a hammer. "I know everything." Julia's lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "I've spent weeks watching you," I continued. "Every lie, every betrayal. It's all documented. And just so you know, Daniel's little empire is already falling apart as we speak. You might want to call him, though I doubt he'll pick up. He's probably too busy dealing with law enforcement. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, but I grabbed it before she could touch it. Don't bother, I said. It's over, Julia. For the next hour, I laid everything out for her. The fake files, the flagged transactions, the frozen accounts. She tried to deny it at first, then pivoted to anger, then finally to desperation. Mark, please, she begged, tears streaming down her face. I can explain. I wasn't thinking. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Save it, I said coldly. You knew exactly what you were doing. You didn't just betray me. You tried to destroy me. And now, you're facing the consequences. Before leaving the room, I handed her a small stack of papers. What's this? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Divorce papers, I said, already walking away. Sign them by the end of the week, or I'll make sure Daniel isn't the only one under investigation. As I closed the door behind me, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was over. The woman I thought I could trust had turned out to be my greatest enemy, but I had beaten her at her own game. For the first time in months, I felt free. Julia and Daniel had underestimated me, and they had paid the price. Now, it was time to start over. On my terms. By the time I left the house that night, the storm I had orchestrated was already tearing Julia and Daniel's lives apart. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, exactly. It was clarity. A kind of cold, sharp awareness that I'd done what needed to be done. I drove to my new penthouse across the city, a place Julia didn't even know existed. I'd planned for this day for weeks, and now, as I stepped through the front door, the weight of her betrayal finally began to lift. The sleek, minimalist space felt like a sanctuary, free of the lies and manipulations that had consumed my life. But I wasn't done yet. The next morning, I made coffee and sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city come alive. My phone buzzed incessantly, updates pouring in from the chaos I'd set in motion. The first was a news alert. Daniel Green's assets had been frozen, and his development firm was under investigation for financial crimes. His investors had pulled out en masse, and one had already filed a lawsuit. The second was from a friend at Interpol. Your tip worked, the message read. We've got him under surveillance, and it won't be long before formal charges are filed. Julia's name wasn't in the news, yet. She was careful enough to keep herself one step removed from Daniel's illicit dealings, but her involvement with him was clear in the evidence I'd collected. I suspected she'd try to distance herself now that everything was falling apart, but she couldn't escape me. Julia showed up at my penthouse 2 days later. I don't know how she found the address, but when I opened the door, there she was, pale, disheveled, and desperate. Mark, she said, her voice trembling. Please, I need to talk to you. I stepped aside, letting her in. I wasn't interested in theatrics or drawn-out explanations. I just wanted to hear what she had to say. She paced the living room, wringing her hands. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, she started. Daniel, he manipulated me. I didn't know what I was getting into. I thought it was just a business opportunity. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and let her ramble. And the affair? I asked finally, cutting through her excuses. Her eyes filled with tears. It was a mistake, she said, her voice cracking. I was lonely, Mark. You were so busy with work and I held up a hand to stop her. Don't, I said coldly. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was about loneliness. You weren't just unfaithful. You tried to destroy me. You stole from me. Lied to me. You used me. Julia collapsed onto the couch, her head in her hands. I've lost everything, she sobbed. Daniel's gone. My reputation is ruined. Please, Mark. I need your help. I stared at her for a long moment, marveling at the audacity of it all. Even now, after everything, she thought I might save her. You made your choices, I said finally. Now, you get to live with the consequences. I handed her a manila envelope before she left. What's this? She asked, her voice trembling. Insurance, I replied. Inside were copies of every piece of evidence I had against her. The financial records, the recordings, The emails. Enough to bury her if she ever thought about coming after me. You try to pull anything, I said, my tone icy, and I'll make sure the authorities have this within the hour. Julia clutched the envelope, her face a mask of despair. She knew she was beaten. Goodbye, Julia, I said, holding the door open. She hesitated for a moment, as if she wanted to say something, but instead she walked out, shoulders slumped. In the weeks that followed, I watched from a distance as Julia and Daniel's lives unraveled. Daniel was arrested on charges of corporate espionage and fraud, and Julia's association with him blacklisted her from the real estate world. As for me, I returned to my business with renewed focus. The damage they'd done was superficial at best, and the steps I'd taken to secure my company ensured its survival. But more than that, I felt free. Julia's betrayal had been a painful reminder that even the people you trust most can turn against you. Yet, it had also shown me the strength of my own resolve. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Julia, not with longing, but with curiosity. I wonder what she tells herself when she looks in the mirror. Does she regret what she did? Or does she still think she was justified? It doesn't matter. What matters is that I survived. I outplayed her. I won. Standing on the balcony of my penthouse, the city sprawling beneath me, I feel a strange sense of peace. The world is unpredictable, chaotic, and sometimes cruel. But I've learned that with enough patience, preparation, and resolve, you can turn even the worst betrayal into a victory. The scars remain, but so does the lesson. Trust is a luxury, and in my world, it's one I can't afford.